joining us, we have another person who came all the way from the West Coast of the United States of America. And so please, coming to talk to us about accessibility at scale, please welcome Mallika Potter.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Cool, hopefully you haven't fallen asleep yet. So I'll strive to be entertaining. If I'm not entertaining, I'll strive to be somewhat informative. So, all right, let's get started. So, as you heard, my name's Mallika. I'm from San Francisco. I don't have a clicker, so you're gonna have to bear with me like walking back to my laptop to move the slides. I'm an Android developer, but more specifically, I'm an Android developer at Thumbtack, which is not launched in Canada, but it's a service for helping customers find professionals for whatever job they want to do, from house cleaning to lawn mowing, et cetera, and for small businesses to grow their customer base. Been asked by recruiting to tell y'all that we are hiring if you would like to work in San Francisco with me. But this isn't about me. This is about Amy. So meet Amy. Amy has 4 parrots. She's an avid pet lover. Amy loves to cook. Recently, she bought an open air fryer for the first time. And like most of us, Amy uses her phone and various apps on it to function every day. She uses Facebook to keep up with her friends. She uses Messenger to message her family. She uses Yelp to find new restaurants. She uses Google Maps to navigate to new places. Amy is also 100% blind. Amy is, we're going to use US statistics right here. Amy is part of the 1 in 5 people in the United States who has some form of disability. To break that down further, 1 in 5 is 20%. That's more than 50 million people just in the United States. For comparison, the population of Spain, measured in 2014, is 46 million people. But if we're going to break this down further, so I'm going to use some stats from 2010 US Census. I know we're in Canada, but bear with me here. Breaking this down further, 8.1 million people in 2010 in the US had some form of vision impairment. A vision impairment can range somewhere from color blindness to slightly damaged eyesight to 100% blindness. 19.9 million people in the United States in 2010 had difficulty lifting or grasping. And a lot of people think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to phones. There's small movements, that sort of thing. But it does apply, because difficulty lifting and grasping means having trouble with complex or repetitive motions. So if you were going to use Tinder or something, repetitive swiping, that can actually be really hard on some people. Not only that, but difficulty lifting or grasping can include people who have temporary injuries. For example, I broke my wrist last year, and suddenly I was unable to use pretty much all of my apps because I could barely move my thumb, and I just couldn't function. And last but not least, 7.6 million people have some form of hearing impairment, whether this is slightly problematic hearing all the way to 100% deafness. But that's just in the United States. In the world, it was last estimated that over 15% of the world has some form of disability. That's over 1 billion people. If, as developers, we really want to be serious about using our technology to connect people all over the world, then we can't ignore this 15%. All right, so now that I've convinced you all about the importance of accessibility, let me explain to you why it's not as hard to make your app accessible as you think it is. So I feel like the biggest problem that people worry about is when they talk about accessibility, and everyone can agree it's a good thing, there's a large customer base that could use it, but as we were making our product, we were growing new, we were trying to constantly push out stuff really quickly, we built up this tech debt, and it seems almost impossible to make my app accessible at this point. it's not actually as hard as you think. And so over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to break down kind of the methodology of how you can analyze your app and figure out what areas to correct it on and the first steps to do to correct it. And the first step of doing that is actually using a heuristic that you learned in probably around 3rd grade English. They have grades in Canada. I don't know if you guys use the same terminology here. And specifically, what you might have learned when you were writing a basic essay, you'd have to name who, what, where, when, why, and how. Or more specifically, you can actually cut out a few of those and focus on who, when, why, and how. So let's dive into these. Let's break these down. Who? So when I did the overview, I was talking about the visual impairments, motion impairments, all that sort of stuff. It seems like a lot of people. So let's break down which subpopulation does your app target the most. Is your app a very visual app? Would it be problematic for people who have visual impairments? Does your app require a lot of touch movement? Does your app have auditory-only signaling? What subpopulation would you want to focus on first? So let's start with people who have visual impairments. So the first target you kind of think of is color blindness. Are you using colors in a way that someone who has some form of color blindness would have trouble telling them apart, right? And that's usually, there's a wide range of color blindness, but it's usually red-green differences, that sort of thing. Are you signaling things solely in a visual manner? So when you pop up a notification, do you have an auditory component to that? Are you only signaling when something is done with a visual sort of imagery without an auditory component to that? So a lot of people think that, my app is too visual for someone who is blind to use. And my app's primarily pictures. For example, I used to work at Pinterest, and I headed the accessibility initiative there. And if you know what Pinterest is, you know that it's a very, very visual app. And so as we were talking to users, Amy in specific, she said that, if you believe in the mission of your product, you should know that your application has a lot more uses than just visual. For example, Amy is using products that weren't designed with her in mind. But she's still using them. She's using them in unique, different ways. So your app, even if it's mostly visual, can still be used by you should still be considering users like this. All right, so back to motion. 19.9 million people in the US alone who have motion issues, but also people who get temporarily injured with their hands, which is often a lot more common of an injury than we think, between repetitive stress injuries, that sort of thing. So, or using repetitive gestures, etc. And then hearing. This one's pretty straightforward. People who have hearing impairments might use transcripts or captions a lot. So are you supporting that with your video and that sort of thing? All right, so if you're not sure of what subpopulation you should target first for accessibility fixes, try user testing. So not just standard user testing. What I find the best way to do is to get a working group together of people with a wide array, whether it be relatives of your developers or partnering with a local association. You'll often find a lot of disability advocacy organizations in cities, and partnering with them just to walk through your service and figure out what are their biggest pain points. All right, so why should we care about accessibility? As I was saying earlier, it's a very large market. And to be honest, it's a largely untapped market. People who have disabilities in general have very limited access to a lot of products. Just making small incremental improvements can suddenly elevate your product to one that is used every day, because there just aren't a lot of options out there. And then we bring back to the numbers, 8.1 million people, 19.9 million people, 7.6 million people. But also, I feel like accessibility is an issue that affects everyone because you never know where your life is going to go in the next 5 years and if you're someone who will need this service in the future. All right, when? So let's be realistic about the timeline you have. Unless you work at Google and they have a specific accessibility team, you're probably not an accessibility developer full-time. Maybe you're a performance developer, just an app developer, that sort of thing. So you need to think realistically about the timeline you have to make these changes. A lot of people feel like if they can't completely overhaul their technology, that there's no point in doing it, and that's just not true. Even incremental changes can be really life-changing for people. So if you have a few months to work on this, in like some spare time, you should focus on making like low-hanging fruit technology changes. If you have a few years, which is a little unlikely, you should focus on building a culture of accessibility, or better, a culture of inclusivity. And I'll be talking a little bit about that a little later on. All right, and then the longest part of the talk, how? How are you going to identify and figure out what parts of your app need accessibility fixes the most? So I'm going to walk you through kind of the first 5 stages of doing an audit of your app. And then we'll talk about how you can prioritize fixes and what the biggest problem areas usually are. So first, figure out what you currently have. The best way to figure out what you currently have is to do some form of audit. And there are services out there who you can pay a lot of money to, and they will audit your app, and they'll give you a really nice long list of fixes, and they'll have user testing and all that sort of thing. But the thing is, if you haven't gone and audited your own app first, what they're going to find is all the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that you should fix before handing your app off to a service like that, if you choose to do that. So the best thing to do is to run your own audit. I find it probably takes about a workday to run an audit if you're going to be really thorough. And so let's talk about the kind of five areas you should focus on when running your audit. All right, Talkback. So if you have, has anyone here used Talkback on an Android device? Want to raise your hand if you have? Well, that's exciting. That is off more than most. That is more than most conferences. So basically, Talkback is, if you're familiar with iOS's screen reader, or a web screen reader, is very similar to that, except it also, you can use it to use simplified gestures to control navigation throughout your app. So I'm going to show you guys a quick little demo of Talkback, or a video, using my favorite app to demo things on, the Google App Store. All right.
Got it button. Selected, home, games, movies and TV, books, home, for you selected button, heading, in list, 7 items. Get started, browse our go-to apps, more, out of list. Get started. App the Weather Channel, local forecast and weather maps. Star rating, 4.4, in list, 20 items. Double tap to activate. Headings. Details for app, the web, overview.
Yeah, so it can be a bit of a frustrating experience sometimes. But honestly, what I would suggest is just turning on Talkback for your application and trying to use it that way for a day. Or if you can do it for a week. I definitely keep Talkback on a large percentage of the time, just so I know what kind of optimizations there are. So we'll kind of dive into like the app optimizations for Talkback, but we'll just move on to the next part for right now. All right, so the next thing you want to check is text scaling. So if you go into your accessibility features on your phone, you should be able to change the text scaling. And this is actually a common feature used by older users of smartphones. And as you know, the current generation ages, and there are more older users of smartphones, this is going to become even more and more important. I personally have really bad eyesight, and so I actually keep my text scaled up usually. So this is personally a feature that's very important to me. So I'll just show you guys on the Google App Store again what happens when you text scale. So this is a good example of like a well-scaled text one. You can see like everything expands, that sort of stuff. So you have to kind of be thinking about how, when you create your layouts, if I scaled all my text up, is my layout still going to make sense? And have I put equal padding on it, that sort of stuff? Have I designed this in a way that it's not has very fixed sizing? Is it scalable? That sort of thing. The next thing that some people like to use is magnification. So this is allowing you to basically zoom in with often a triple tap, and you can also turn this on in your accessibility settings. So you have to kind of think, what is my app going to look like if I'm zoomed in on a small portion of it? Is it going to look grainy? Is it going to look weird? Will it make any sense in context? Show you another example of zoomed in. How do your images look when they're zoomed in? Do they still make sense? All right, display size increase. So this is very similar to text size increase. You can also turn this on. I also often turn this on. It will reshuffle all of your apps as it moves into other pages to make more room because it's increasing the size, so just fair warning there. And this doesn't just resize, your text, it resizes everything, makes everything larger. So how does your layout scale, basically, the entire layout? Do stuff compress? Are you able to like swipe through it? Are you able to scroll? That sort of items. So here's another example. And then the fourth thing that you should look at is the accessibility scanner. Does anybody know what the accessibility scanner is? Anyone? Cool. Do you want to tell us what the accessibility scanner is, since you raised your hand and volunteered?
I'm going to regret that. The app is downloaded from the Play Store that will go through and give you a report like, hey, app is already running on your phone.
Yep. So if you didn't hear that, it's an app that basically you turn it on, and you can basically it takes a screenshot of whatever you're looking at, and it gives you a report on like color contrast, labeling. Are you using things that aren't supported by accessibility? Do you have repeats of labels, that sort of thing? And it's not, you used to have to download for the Play Store in older versions, but if you're on Android, the most recent version of Android, it should be actually included in your accessibility developer settings. So you should already have it. And I'll just show you a quick look of what a report shows. So this is the report on the Google Play Store app, which is actually quite a few things. So it shows that everyone has a little bit of work to do. And so all the highlighted areas are areas of potential issue. Maybe it's contrast, maybe it's mislabeling, that sort of thing. It'll download a zip file with all the things highlighted and telling you what you need to do to fix them for certain issues. So this is super useful. Honestly, this makes auditing an app on Android super easy, way more easier than auditing it on iOS, where they don't have something like this. So that's honestly the first step that I would do in any audit. All right, so let's talk about, now that you know what's wrong with your app, how we can fix it. All right, so I find the biggest issue with applications is almost often is that people don't add labels. You need to describe your user interface controls. If you remember back to the video for Talkback, as we were clicking through it, it was telling you, what it was highlighting, what it was on, what would happen if you could double tap it to open it up, that sort of thing. But you need to add labels to tell it what's going on. Now, if you have text, if it's a text view, it usually will read that for you, but maybe that's not what you want it to say, because maybe the text on it isn't actually the context someone needs. When you're describing user interface controls, you also have to think, should this have a label? If this is something that isn't clickable, if it's just a pretty hero image or something like that, does that really need to be described? Is that really a necessary item for someone who is trying to just navigate through quickly? Because when you saw that video, you saw there's so much stuff that it's reading out. You're clicking through a lot of things. That can be really overwhelming for someone if you have labeled all your non-necessary items that aren't navigation items. You also have to think, do I have appropriate context? If I was just listening to this and I land on this screen, what is the first thing that I am going to hear? Does that make sense? And then also, do you have repeats of labels? So oftentimes you'll have a header, right, that says I don't know, Newsfeed, right? But you might also have a button at the bottom that also says Newsfeed. Will someone who's listening to that be confused about why there's multiple Newsfeed buttons? That sort of item. All right. Enable focus-based navigation. So this focus-based navigation is just basically using Talkback or something that's called a directional pad, which is something that you can plug into your phone or technology or whatever, that basically allows you to control it manually, like clicking a switch, that sort of thing. So the nice thing about Android is that all of this is pretty much built into all the standard Android components. If you're just building your app from standard Android components, or you're extending them and not doing too much changes, honestly, you probably have a ton of accessibility already baked in. Your app is probably a lot more accessible than you think. The one scenario where that changes is when you get really into custom view controls. So custom views are awesome. And oftentimes we want the capabilities that aren't baked into the general Android library, right? But what often happens is we haven't enabled accessibility for our custom views. And I'll be digging in deeper how to build a view tree and that sort of thing in a few more slides forward. But if you're oftentimes custom views, especially if they're just drawables or something along that lines, don't have the same accessibility capability. All right. This one's a pretty straightforward thing. Don't have audio only feedback. If something completes, pop up a toast, as well as having some sort of notification sound, right? Pretty straightforward, not that complicated. And then, finally, minimum touch size. So Google recommends that all touch targets be 48 by 48. I know this isn't feasible for a lot of things. It's not always the ideal tap target, though a tap target can be larger, as we all know, than what is visible. However, if you think back to, for example, when I broke my wrist, right? I can't really move my thumb that much. It's suddenly a lot harder to hit small tap targets. So maybe your tap targets can't be 48 by 48, but can they be bigger than 16 by 16 or something along those lines? All right. So that's a lot of possible fixes. Let's talk about prioritizing your fixes. What ones are probably the most important fixes? First, Talkback. Talkback, this includes labeling things as well as making sure you've enabled touch-based navigation. So the thing is that this is the most used. This is probably the most used accessibility software, and so it's important that it's accessible for that. So the first thing everyone should do is go through and label. Color contrast. I find a good way to check your color contrast is to turn your phone black and white and to take a look at that. If you have trouble being able to identify navigation items and that sort of thing when your phone is black and white, probably not great for color contrast. Also, the Android accessibility scanner will also identify issues of color contrast for you so that you know where to fix them already. Oops. Third, visual-only signaling. I find that this is probably, I think this is a little more important than audio-only signaling just because it's a little more common, is to have some sort of visual identifier without some sort of audio identifier. Now, maybe this is that the audio identifier is through Talkback, so if Talkback is turned on, there's an audio identifier if you don't want to constantly be spamming your user with sounds, or they can turn off the sound or something along those lines. But having some sort of audio signaling alongside your visual signaling is actually really important for people who have vision issues. And then audio-only signaling should also have some sort of visual component, a toast, that sort of thing. If you are not sure, what you think is the most important, again, the best thing to do is just to turn on the accessibility features yourself. I would highly suggest spending a day with the text size up or the display size up. If possible, spending a day with Talkback on, if it doesn't drive you too crazy from the constant talking. And just finding out what features are the most inaccessible at this time. All right. And then here's all the things that I told you we would talk about later, aka the likely problems that you're going to run into. All right, so we have complex content to display. Content that is not necessarily can be completely encapsulated just using standard Android libraries. Custom views are awesome. They are also often problematic for accessibility. So I'm not going to dig too deeply into this. I'm just going to send you guys a link. But I'm just going to give you guys a quick overview of what you can work on to make your custom views more accessible for focus-based navigation. So a virtual view hierarchy is a tree of imaginary views that is part of the view that is reported as part of the view hierarchy when an accessibility service explores the window. So basically, what you're going to do. Since this virtual view doesn't exist, your custom class is responsible for managing the accessibility node info that is responsible for describing this invisible tree to accessibility services. So basically, for example, a calendar, if you're going to make a custom calendar, right? Think of what this view tree might look. So maybe your custom calendar is completely drawable, and you're calculating the touch targets based on where it is, and then you say, okay, if this in the model is, this is old style, but if this in the model is a certain area, click this, right? So what you want to represent in your virtual view is this concept of okay, here's the month, here's the days, here's where can I adjust the thing, so that when you click in that area, it reads out what you're changing, just in Talkback. All right, working with designers. Are there any designers here? Raise your hand if you're a designer. Woo, one. It's exciting. So it's not, when I say working with design as a problem, I don't mean designers are a problem. I just mean that it's building a culture of inclusivity starts with designers. Because you can go back and make as many changes after the fact as you want, but if you're not designing for inclusivity, for accessibility, for color contrast, for text sizes, for tap targets, it's always going to be kind of like a backwards compatibility race. Making sure that you are synced in with design is really important, as I think it is pretty much important for pretty much any product. All right, too little time, too many fixes. Like I said earlier, accessibility is probably not your day job. It might not even be your second day job. It's really important to prioritize the fixes and to remember that, quite honestly, you're probably not going to be able to fix everything. And that's not an awful thing. I don't know about you, but I'm a perfectionist. I want everything to be perfect and wonderfully working at all times. But it's just important to remember that even incremental steps can make the difference from your product not being usable at all to being usable. Maybe it's not usable in the ideal state. Maybe it's not as wonderful an experience as you would like, but it's still so much better. And you're still opening your product to a huge market of people who were unable to use it. Regression. I find this is honestly the biggest problem. You go in, you've audited everything. You've labeled everything. Everything is wonderful. And then someone lands a new commit and wipes out everything, wipes out half the changes you made because they updated and didn't label stuff. And as much as everyone hates these, the best way to fix this is linters. So Android comes with the default accessibility linters for image views and a few other things. Edit text, making sure you have content descriptions, that sort of thing. What I would suggest is if you have a lot of custom views that are used, extending these linters, writing a new linter that extends the standard accessibility linter to catch these as well, to make sure that they have content descriptions. It's actually really straightforward. If you just look at the old linter, it's very straightforward. And it can make a lot of difference so that people aren't constantly checking in stuff that is going to break accessibility. All right, building support. So before I was talking about a culture of inclusivity or a culture of accessibility, I feel like a lot of people think that they're like, oh, I'm interested in accessibility. I want to help make my product more accessible or inclusive, that sort of thing. But it's just one person. I can't change it. The thing is there's probably there might be a bunch of people at your company who are thinking the same thing. Seek them out. For example, when I worked at Pinterest, we started with just a couple of engineers who were like, oh, I'm interested in accessibility. It turns out that a bunch of people, whether it was a few designers, a few engineers here or there, were all on their own, working in their own lanes, trying to make small incremental changes. But when we just reached out to find out who else was interested and we pooled our efforts, it can magnify your impact. It's important, I feel like, to have buy-in when it comes to accessibility, inclusivity, from all parts of the product. So whether that be product managers, engineering managers, designers, engineers. That doesn't mean that everyone has to be actively working on it at all times, but I think it's important to find allies in every sector of the product work to make sure that it's something that's being thought of. Also, there's a lot more support outside of your company than you think. When I was talking about disability advocacy groups, most major cities have some form, and there's also a lot online. For example, in San Francisco, I've worked with Lighthouse for the Blind, which is an advocacy group for people with visual impairments. They like to run focus groups so that people can get the input of people with visual impairments, so that companies can improve their services, improve their applications. There's also more accessible in meetups and that sort of thing than people think. There's a somewhat active online communities of accessibility engineers. You just have to know where to look for. Has everyone ever heard of the hero's journey? Yeah, it's a fantasy building block, kind of the archetype of most fantasy stories. I think the most famous example is probably Lord of the Rings, but I mean, it fits for most of the things. So there's a few different steps, like find a mentor. Mentor dies. Point of no return or whatever, right? You have to learn to defeat the evil king, wizard, et cetera, that sort of thing. One of the steps is finding allies and friends. And there's a reason it's one of the steps. So, building an accessible app might not be quite the same as, slaying a dragon or something. But I think it follows kind of the same archetype. And any task is easier with colleagues. All right, as engineers, we want to solve problems. And as non-engineers, we also want to solve problems. That's why technology was invented, to solve problems, to connect people, that sort of thing. It's important that if we're going to do that we don't just connect people who are like ourselves, who are able-bodied, who are the same gender, same race as ourselves. It's important that we're trying to connect as wide and diverse a population as possible, because that's the only way that we can really create the next best thing. Yep, that's pretty much it. So that's why I think it's just really important for everyone to, when we're designing our applications, to take a second and think, how will someone who's different than me be able to use this? How will someone who doesn't have my cultural experiences, who doesn't have my same capabilities, how can they use this? Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Is there questions? I'll come around with the microphone. Just one second.
Thank you. It was very informative. I have a question related to security. It is known that when we enable accessibility in our apps, it also opens up security loopholes. For example, especially the screen reader. Any other app running in the background can keep on reading and getting the information which is being talked back and send it for whatever reason. So do you follow any strategies to make sure that we are not putting our users at risk?
Yeah, great question. So I think Well, first, it depends on kind of what your application is and what sort of information is shared. I think it's really important that you be very diligent when labeling Talkback, when enabling Talkback, to think about exactly what information you're sharing through Talkback. And unfortunately, I think that's just kind of a manual process. There's also a lot of accessibility fixes if you're really concerned about security and you don't want to kind of have to think about that sort of thing. Color contrast, all that sort of issues. But to be honest, even if you haven't gone and developed exclusively for Talkback and that sort of thing, there are still going to be users using it. I think it's better to try to be proactive and develop thinking about how users are going to use these accessibility services rather than just hope that they're not going to use them.
Another question over here.
Hi. So in terms of actually testing accessibility in terms of like automation, have you actually used Espresso before?
Yeah. So Espresso is actually really great for, you can actually use Espresso for writing accessibility-based tests. There's a few different third-party open source like library GitHub projects out there. I used to have a link for it. I do not have it in the current iteration of the slides. I can try to find it if you want and give it to you.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I will give it to Jeff or something. But yes, there's actually a few different third-party libraries out there that can help you, you can use Espresso to write talkback tests and that sort of thing to make sure that you don't have to do all this manual testing constantly.
Right. And just to give you a heads up, in Canada, like you actually have to follow a certain level of accessibility for the apps. And in the next couple of years, it'll be enforced.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so.
It's exciting to know. I hope the US catches up.
We got one question at the front over here, I think.
Actually, I have a three question.
Okay.
Sorry, three short questions. About the image view, do you have any experience to leverage the accessibility for the image view? Because we have a gallery, users, after we show users some photo, is any way to leverage that one with accessibility?
Yeah, usually what I do is if you're real-time loading the images and that sort of stuff, just adding a content descriptor there based on your subtitle, whatever text. There should be some sort. Do you have some sort of caption associated with your images,
For example, you can have a different picture based on the user, so it's not very deterministic how kind of picture is. So about the coloring, the description, this kind of visual.
Yeah. So usually, if I don't think it's necessarily an important item for that's a navigation item, you can usually just put in some sort of placeholder caption for it, something like user avatar image, that sort of thing, or maybe the name of the user or something like that. If you think the image is really important, the best thing to do is see if you can get some caption data for that and just assign that at the time of loading the image as the content descriptor.
Okay. Second question about the Talkback. Our application currently supports around 16 different languages. So I found that in translation, sometimes some words are very, not meaningful. Is the way that, have you experienced with the Talkback in the different languages?
I have not done a ton of, I've just done it in English and Spanish and that sort of thing. I mean, I think that honestly, that one depends on just your labeling of the items. That's going to require a little more manual work, making sure that you're giving meaningful labels to it. I feel like the auto-generated labels and that sort of stuff you can have problems, like you said, with other languages. I don't have a great solution to that. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. And the third question about the offline. When we offline, still Talkback is behave correctly, or is rely on the Google service on the back for the?
Talkback will still work offline.
Thank you very much.
Cool. I think your first question was a two-part question as well, so I think you tucked 4 questions into that. I'm pretty impressed.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the great talk. And my question is there are there any established standards for audio and visual aids? Because as I'm developing an application, I don't want to have different sounds than people with disabilities are expecting.
So there's a lot of web standards out there that I would suggest that people conform to. I feel like for accessibility, web's been around longer. The standards are much more established. Google also updates their accessibility standards every year with every new Android release. So if you go online, you can find their accessibility standards, which should have some suggestions. Also, if your app's certainly accessible enough, they will also give you a little badge on the App Store that says that your app's accessible, which is, I don't know, I think that's a nice perk.
Hi. What are the model apps that you would say have the best accessibility? Like which apps would you say?
All right, that's a good question. I would say, I know a lot of people don't like it, Facebook is actually very good at accessibility. While often the new features that are running out aren't always accessible, they do have an accessibility team that's often working hard to update those and to make it very accessible. When I talked to people who use accessibility software, they're big fans of Facebook.
Okay. Other than Facebook, are there other apps?
Yeah, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is pretty good at accessibility. Lyft is actually has quite an active accessibility team.
Okay. And as for resources, other than Google, where else do you get information about the best practices? All about accessibility.
Yeah, what I would do is look up to see if you have any disability advocacy groups in your city. They often have like a lot of guidelines and suggestions. And if you're in San Francisco, you can look up Lighthouse for the Blind. Often most cities have some sort of advocacy group.
Cool. I think there's actually a few more questions, but I'm sure people can reach out to you in some way post-conference.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't put that on the slide.
We can find a way to distribute that out if you want to maybe tweet something out or something like that.
Yeah. You can just do Mallika at thumbtack.com. You feel free to email me with your questions. I closed my Twitter account, so.
Cool. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause, please. Thanks so much, Mallika.